It is.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming just watching time here, being careful for everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Walter Gaudette. He's our managing principal of our Ontario offices at HDR. And I might do a little introduction for myself a little later on. 171 years of continuing practice. It's a pretty interesting topic for us. We kind of hope that it'll be as interesting as possible for you, of course, this morning. We wrote this abstract last fall, and our legacy here in Ontario, going back to John Power, and you might know Mill and Ross Architects as one of the moments in time, if you will, goes back 171 years. And so you'll see a bit of that journey here today. One thing that we did want to mention, we would like to dedicate the talk this morning to a colleague of ours that unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago from our Penticton practice. And so thinking of legacy a little bit today, he has really left an incredible one for us.
So thank you, everyone. And actually, we do have mics if we are hard to hear, or feel free to come up to the front. Either way, put up your hand if you have difficulty hearing, we can mic up. But otherwise, I think we're just going to try to project. So as Jason-Emery said, I mean, I think we were reminded of the film Memento. I mean, you almost have to start at the present and go backward to figure out what your legacy is. But nevertheless, we are here representing HDR. Globally, HDR is 100 years old in 1917, a lot of anniversaries this year. And so just a little bit about us before we get into the actual program. As I said, sort of a comparison of where we are today versus where we've come from. So HDR is the #1 healthcare firm in the world, a huge focus on healthcare and really on wellness holistically. You see some of those other topics where we sort of rank near the highest, top 5. Culture, science, education. Really a holistic focus within the architectural practice on improving the human condition, I guess, is as we think about it. Just a quick walk through some of the projects. Again, advancing health and wellness at all scales. Here locally, Humber River in Toronto. World-class S&T environments, Argonne National Lab in the US, and really our own national lab here, the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories in Chalk River. We've begun some major projects at Chalk River. Public buildings of all sorts, usually focused on public safety, so again, a fire station in Galveston, but also an entry for the new regional airport in Kingston. That's on the books and we're waiting to hear back on. So today we are going to walk you at a pretty brisk pace, again, hopefully to keep you awake, through 171 years of history, but really with a focus on explicit moves that were made and what has enabled the practice to survive that long, to literally be handed from leader to leader over 171 years. So a focus on the early years, sort of a mid-century evolution into modern design, 21st century expansions geographically, and our current aspirations for the future. And I guess my turn to introduce Jason-Emery Groen. So Jason-Emery is our design director out of the Kingston office. I should say I'm based here in Ottawa, but the two of us together, and more so Jason-Emery as the historian of the moment will walk through the bulk of the presentation.
I would say amateur historian, probably, but passionate about it, no question. We were talking earlier, just before the talk started, about how this subject came up for us, and I had heard the stories of the tales of all these 171 years for years, actually, and in my case, that would be about 17 years with the firm. And I'd always been intrigued by a lot of the different things that I'd heard, and sometimes those stories morphed a little bit. They kind of fit the nature of what was the topic at hand, and so I thought I'd get to the accuracy of it a little bit more and do a little bit more digging, and then started to discover that it wasn't just where we had come from, but it was how we had evolved over time and some of that recent evolution to kind of really set the stage for where we are today. And Walter's going to talk about some of our aspirations moving forward. So if we think about the term legacy, as a noun or even as an adjective, I think all three elements on the screen I could probably relate to in this talk. And I probably won't tell you exactly what might have been outdated or what phase or what segment of the firm, but there were interesting moments where the firm changed and evolved. So in terms of starting the talk, we thought, well, we suppose we could start when the first individual emigrated immigrated from the UK, from Britain. But actually, there was a bit of an interesting parallel. So in terms of thinking of establishment, the firm was established, or the individual established the firm in Kingston. And at the time, of course, the Act of the Union had passed. It was 1941. And from 1841 until 1844, Kingston was the first capital of the province of Canada. It was the name at the time. And so something that we found quite interesting, and I know someone in this audience is working in this building right now on a project with our office. The longest standing client we have is this client, the Kingston General Hospital. Also happens to be the longest continuing hospital in the country. I was even surprised to realize that that wasn't further east in the country. Along with that, it was also where the first House of Parliament and the first sessions occurred. So we actually know the exact rooms where that happened, and we've actually worked on this building in many facets since. In 18, I'll stay in the right century, 1846, this gentleman, John Power, immigrates to Canada from England. He's from Devonshire, and he actually comes from a builder and architect family, and comes across, obviously by boat, and starts to kind of begin his own sense of self-discovery here locally or regionally. At the time, Kingston had literally just become incorporated. John Counter was the first mayor of the city. This is the City Hall pictured here. And our studio is literally right about where the pointer is on the wall. We're literally almost next to the building, if you will. These fortifications don't actually quite exist like that anymore. I'm sure most people in the room would know. The Confederation Basin and Harbor is there now. So we were really curious to find out what was the first project that John actually worked on. And would that first project have any relevance to the work that we do today? Well, I would argue that that apprenticeship and that first set of work certainly did. Walter mentioned that healthcare is an extremely important portion of our portfolio. It's what we do a considerable amount of work in. And it turns out that John Power's first project, when he came to work, wasn't necessarily for himself, but was for Edward Horsey, the brother of a gentleman that he came over with, a fellow countryman from the same region in Britain, and he worked on the hospital wing for the Kingston Penitentiary. So it was a very interesting first project that I don't think he intended for us to continue working in that exact market sector for literally almost 2 centuries, but sure enough, it was really the first project. So as he set off on his own, most architects at the time, obviously, there was a residential market to conquer. It was a relatively accessible one. Kingston was expanding, although not quite as rapidly in the 50s as it was earlier, obviously, since the capital had moved, but there was still quite a bit of merchant activity. And with the shipbuilding and various things at the time, this gentleman, McIntosh, had promised his family that he would build them a castle on the lake. Well, it turned out to be a pretty small castle, and it's actually not on the lake. It's a pretty distant view to the lake, and the story doesn't get any better. He went bankrupt halfway through the construction of the project, and poor John Power's first original project actually was sold midway. He did finish it for a second client, but he learned the school of hard knocks in what we call contract admin today. An interesting thing is that he, unlike his father, tendered all of his work. So the family that he came from in the business were designers, architects, builders at the time. But he actually set off on a bit of a different course, and as best as we understand, all of his work was tendered at the time. He didn't actually work as the builder or with the builder in that capacity, but rather as what we would consider a design bid build approach today. So the first advertisement that we found was in 1852. So this was in the British Wake, the Daily British Wake, which you're going to hear a lot of this today, the oldest continuing newspaper in Canada. There's all, a lot of these things have happened in Kingston, obviously, and somehow been maintained. Interestingly enough, a short time or a little while after that, John actually designed the new building for them on King Street in Kingston. And actually, before I leave that, I thought I might just read that. Kind of an interesting approach to defining what an architect did back then. Artificers work accurately measured and computed, and disputed accounts equitably adjusted.
Right to the thief.
Well, there you go. I mean, what's changed? Of course, as John started to develop the practice, he met a lot of different individuals and clients, just as we would today. And this particular client, Captain Gaskin, was a very influential individual in Kingston at the time, in the shipbuilding industry. And this house in particular, the Parkview House, you might hear a few of these anecdotes as well today. I drive by this house every day to work, literally. Drive by most of this stuff, actually. It's not that big a town still. And this particular house and the client relationship, as best as we gather, really started to create quite a network for John to kind of expand his practice. And so along the way, as we move through time, he actually starts to look at larger work, obviously. And one of his first institutional projects is actually the Napanee Courthouse. So just west, of course. And in 1962, this leads to the design of the jail. And then that actually leads to the design of a school, all within a few years of each other. So this was actually, I suppose you could say that Napanee set John on the map, if you will, to a degree. And where possible, where the buildings still exist, we've tried to show you an image of those as well, in terms of maybe continuing that legacy. So the Presbyterian Church, another project, just literally the year after in Napanee. And so this sketch was done prior to 1865. It was done in 1862. I'm not sure the delay there, but here it is. And what you can't see, which is cut off, is that the steeple actually, as designed, was never built.
That's clever.
What's that?
It's clever the way
it is, yes. It really ends at the top there. It's really kind of odd building that way.
I think you should mention, sorry to interrupt, but
yeah.
just the provenance, I guess, or where you found these drawings, right? I think.
Oh, yes, of course. So, good point. All of these drawings are actually housed in the National Archives. We do, actually, Michael Ross still has a collection of some of the drawings in Kingston, and they relate to some of the clients that were the latest clients for continuing work. But the majority of the drawings, of which there are 26,000 sheets, are actually housed at the National Archives. I didn't access the originals. I accessed the microfiche, obviously, but it was interesting to be able to flip through time and look at these projects. And one thing that I've learned through this is I think it might need to be mandatory for any interns that come into the office to go spend a day and just filter, just flip through the legacy of drawings to kind of understand it. And what's amazing is I probably recognized 50 clients within that set of drawings that we still work with today. It's unbelievable. I would say 50 locations, maybe not clients, but 50 locations that it was quite amazing to see the original drawings of, or at least even on microfilm. This particular project was the first school that John Power started to designed in the region, and we kind of chose this word, forethought, kind of a bit of thinking ahead. It turns out that schoolwork, actually, you'll see in a little bit, allowed for the firm to actually continue through some times of difficulty, in the Great Depression in particular. And so that particular building, unfortunately, no longer exists. It was demolished, but the bell tower does exist in the front lawn of the current Sydenham High School. So as we move along through time, 1867, finally, a group of 13 architects in New York City work hard to legitimize the profession, organize the profession in North America. And so the American Institute of Architects was founded. Not the original name, of course. It was a New York-based institution, but quickly thereafter became what we know now as the AIA. So back to Canada, John Power, his son Joseph, actually joins the firm to carry the legacy. And in fact, as much as John did some incredible work during his period with the firm, Joseph actually really propelled the firm beyond the Kingston borders. He was that first individual that kind of went maybe a little farther than Napanee or even Civic, if you will. Joseph quickly apprenticed and indentured under his father, of course, and they did some competitions. They did a variety of projects. Not all of those were built, of course, so this design for the Methodist Church in Kingston was not actually built, but the buildings were starting to get larger in scale, larger in scope, for sure. And as you can see here on the screen, John actually passes away in 1882. And there's a bit of a flurry of activity that happens after this passing. In 1888, as best as I can understand, I believe this is the first Canadian architectural periodical or journal or magazine to have existed. Within 3 months, Joseph is already setting up for publication. And so in March of that same year, this home, actually, which was being designed at the time, was actually published in the journal. It was a very interesting journal to look at back then in its first edition. And I also drive by that building to work almost every day.
Has your firm marked those properties?
Actually, it's a good question. Not
as a celebration of some anniversary rather than 171?
Not physically that I know of, but I can tell you that that house, along with others, are part of some city tours for the city of Kingston, and they've done a great job actually celebrating John Power proper, and you can actually download the John Power tour.
Okay, so it's there.
Yeah, so there's some interesting things. There's quite a bit of work that has been done, and we just have never found all of this in one place, obviously. So part of this effort for us is to kind of bring it together, for sure. That's a great question. So 1889, we decided to do something similar, and the notion of connecting and bringing folks together and organizing. Actually, the original first word in the first sentence in the documents of the OAA was actually to unify architects, and then it became, there was some other agendas forthcoming after that. But in 1889, the OAA is founded, and Joseph is a founding member of the group, and he has a bit more history of the OAA to come here in a minute. So then in 1892, they start to really expand into a lot more scholastic work. And the Kingston Collegiate Institute, I went to this high school, although I didn't go to this building. This building was demolished by the time I attended. Also the longest, you can finish the sentence. This is an interesting building because it really set the tone for a next step in Joseph and, of course, the legacy of his father's firm in town. And you'll see here in a minute. And then, of course, interestingly enough, I found a bit of debate in terms of the origin of this building. But St. Andrew's on Princess Street in Kingston is it's absolutely gorgeous building. So I'm going back one year, actually, this was 1895. Joseph actually starts to look to advertise nationally. So that same periodical, the Canadian Architect and Builder magazine or journal at the time, had a relatively short listing of architects nationally. So in that period of years, but somehow Power and Son, Joseph, saw fit to put this ad in, and clearly there's no email, there's no telephone, so you just know they exist. That's it. That's all you get. So then, of course, a bit more of a storied history. Joseph Power becomes president of the OAA in 1896. And what's interesting is that he actually advocated for the organization of the education of architecture. And so his address that year really centered around getting better regulation and better standards in terms of the education of an architect at the time. I couldn't see that there was much acted upon within his year after that speech, but it was a very interesting speech to read nonetheless. And I think a lot of it still holds true today. So what I couldn't quite discover is whether or not this was automatic or not, but it was the only time that I ever noticed any member of the firm or the legacy of the firm actually becoming an associate or a member of the Royal Academy of the Arts. And so back then, there were a select number of architects that were invited to actually be part of that. And I suspect it was probably his tenure as the president of the OAA that probably led to that, although I'm speculating here a little bit. From this, there was definitely work that proceeded in the firm, but we noticed a bit of a decline in the volume of the work. And obviously, if Joseph was involved a little more politically, perhaps, in the association, that could have led to it. Otherwise, we don't know quite why. Of course, in 1908, the Architectural Institute of Canada is incorporated, and it's only until actually 1 year later, 1909, that it receives royal ascension to what we know today. And of course, no question, Joseph is a member. So here's an image to kind of give a sense of Kingston circa this time. This is literally 1907, a colored postcard. And you might want to remember that little highlighted area for a little later on. Definitely a thriving kind of port town, a lot of merchant trade within the area, and you can see that was the City Hall there fading away in the top left corner. So this period, quite interesting. Queen's University becomes quite prominent as a client within the firm's work. And there were a variety of small renovations and various things, of course, throughout this period. But one of the first major buildings that we found was a new medical building in 1907 on campus. And this is very much kind of the Queen's feel and fit in terms of materiality, scale, and size. And you'll see that this kind of continues in terms of the trend at the time. So Joseph nor John were the original architects of the City Hall in Kingston. However, they did a lot of extensive work over the years on the City Hall, and one effort in particular was following a major fire, of which there were more than one, to rebuild the cupola and the dome. And then later, I believe it was in the late 70s, early 80s, there was a retrofit and a restoration within the building that the later legacy of the firm Mill and Ross had taken on. So Gordon Hall, interesting building in that Gordon Hall actually gets rebuilt to match its top floor in Kingston. I can't think of too many buildings that actually have an entire floor that was actually rebuilt to its original state. And then Nikhil Hall, literally fading in from the drawing here. Not too many drawings for this building. There were about 42 drawings in the set of this entire building when I looked them up. Unless some have gone missing, that was it. And even then, if you go roll back about 20 to 30 years, about 20 years before that, you could get maybe a half a dozen drawings at best for some of these buildings in the total set. So unless they weren't archived, that's all I was able to find. And it actually looked like a complete story, if you will, flipping through a half a dozen drawings at the time. So of course, undoubted, World War I breaks out, and of course Canada joins. And so we were very curious about how the firm survived at that time. But you're going to have to bear with us a little bit. We're going to flip to another part of the world. We're going to stay on the continent, but we're going to head to the Midwest, and we're going to go south of the border for a few minutes. So right about the same time, 1917, of course, as you know, I'm sure, the U.S. didn't enter the war exactly at the same moment that Canada did, part of the Commonwealth. And as a result, there's this young gentleman by the name of Henningsen, who starts his own practice. At the time, it's an engineering firm, predominantly civil engineering firm. And this is literally the first ad. So suffice it to say, back in 1917, you must identify yourself just a little bit more in your ad, but still, I'm not exactly sure, apart from one place or one street, how to contact them. But here we are. There's what they do. Improvement engineers, they say. Small firm, and with, as you'll see, a fair amount of ambition. So fast forwarding a little bit, of course, World War I ends, and we're curious to see how that had an impact on the firm itself. So Joseph Power at that point is getting up in years, and they're looking for secession of the firm, and a gentleman by the name of Colin Glover, a Scotsman from Edinburgh, he has arrived and had worked for CIBC, the commercial bank of, the Imperial Bank of Commerce at the time, and had moved to Kingston, and then went off to war, but actually, as best as we understand, didn't actually leave the continent. He went into training, but he ended up contriving the bubonic plague, actually, and survived. So after this survival, came back to Kingston, worked with Joseph Power, and soon after, in 1923, was the first true secession of the firm beyond the Powers, Colin Glover, architect. And this school, Central School, was the first project, scholastic project we can find that he worked on. They worked on various parts of the Queen's Observatory. Here's one rendition here that doesn't actually exist anymore. And then here's an aerial in 1919 of Queen's University. Kind of sets the tone. So if anybody recognizes, north is actually over to the right here to give a sense. And the football field that carries the underground parking today is actually still located in the same place in this image. So very, very little development west, as you would have probably imagined in Kingston at the time. So back south of the border, our gentleman Henningsen, they've been busy. They've been working through the Midwest, developing a lot of civic work for various rural neighborhoods, a lot of different towns, a lot of town development at the time. And from there, of course, 1929, the Great Depression hits. And something that we found quite interesting, it was one of the first real solid examples of initiative that we noticed in the firm where even though there was an extreme lack of work, and that would be an understatement, the REA, the Rural Electrification Act, was put in place as part of the New Deal. And Henning went after every single project possible, and the group was actually almost single-handedly responsible for the electrification of the entire state of Nebraska. And so it was quite an interesting effort through 29 to 39. They actually prospered quite well as a result. And you'll see how that kind of influenced the expansion a little later on. So how did that affect Colin Glover here in Ontario? Well, if you remember, there was an effort to kind of perfect or improve the scholastic work, the school work that had been developed. And during the period of the Great Depression, from 1929 to 39, this is not exhaustive, but the majority list of all the different projects, whether they be for the local school board or boards, or Queen's University proper. And a major extension, the one that still exists today, was done in 1931 for KCVI, Kingston Collegiate and Vocational Institute. And as some may know in the room, that building is slated for demolition, unfortunately. But it is the high school I attended, and I did run in and out of that door a lot back in the day. So, having survived and moved through the Great Depression, there were some interesting things that we started to notice in the work. And this is our assumption here, but when I looked through the drawings, we started to notice thicker drawing sets. Maybe a sign of the time. What's that?
Dimensions?
Dimensions, a few more details that we're kind of used to, but a lot more detail in the work. So we're not sure whether or not the reduced number of projects during that time allowed for it. There were other reasons, we actually don't know, but it was quite interesting that there was a marked difference in the work during that time. On top of that, there were two interesting projects. I would argue two of my favorite projects in the city, actually. This house was actually Colin Glover's residence on Macdonell, across from Winston Churchill Public School. And he designed and had this house built at the time. I would speculate, as we designed and built our own home, there's probably moments where you can build a house a little less expensively in terms of labor rates. Well, in the Great Depression, I suspect the labor rates were probably as low as they could possibly be. So we speculate that Colin took the opportunity to design and build a house. But he didn't actually just build that one. And you'll see following this, there was another particular project in the city that certainly we found quite interesting. So here we are. We're coming out of the Great Depression, and we're back again, World War II. Same story. Canada actually participates a little earlier, obviously. The U.S. a little later, as we know, after Pearl Harbor. And we noticed that had a marked difference in terms of how the two firms were operating at the time as well. But this starts to make something quite different in terms of their paths. In the States, Henningsen actually is able to secure what was then, in 1941, a $40 million contract for a U.S. Army base. And if you think of that in today's dollars, that's about $750 million. They were a really tiny practice at the time. So the story goes that every single person and everybody they knew found time to work in the firm to get this work done. And it was a base in Yellowstone, or just outside Yellowstone. It turns out the base didn't actually last more than 2 to 3 years. So there is very little record of it. In fact, only a few foundations left today. So extreme scale shift. Henningsen heads that route, and Colin Glover goes here and works on 64 residences during the time and the period of the war. And this particular house, a favorite of mine actually in Kingston, very different house even today, certainly quite different in its time in 1941, the Trotter House on King Street. So this is literally a block away from Colin's home proper. So as we move through time here a little bit, in terms of the mid-century evolution, actually post-war, a couple of new individuals appear. You'll see a few new protagonists. It's going to move a little quicker here shortly. There's a gentleman by the name of Harry Smith, and Harry was actually born in Ontario and worked in a variety of offices in Toronto as well. And then in 1938, he actually moved to Perth, Australia, and he ended up working for Public Works and ended up working on a major hospital at the time and developing new hospital standards for Australia and the ministry there. And so after that stint, he came back, worked very briefly in Ontario, and then quite quickly joined Colin Glover and it became Drever and Smith Architects in Kingston. And with this, they actually forged quite a partnership that moved forward. You'll see how in a few moments. So very similar in the era. You notice 3 individuals on the left, that's really just 2. But 3 individuals on the right, of course, Henning, Charles, and Willard, they all join up in terms of a larger partnership at HDR. And this is where the HDR does come from. These are the individuals that started that moniker that stays here even with us today. So thinking of being progressive, they felt that they had somewhat tapped out their market in Nebraska. So the deal was, if you wanted to be a senior partner in this firm, you needed to learn how to get your pilot's license, and you had a plane. So they actually bought a fleet of planes. Literally, they had 6 at one point at the biggest number. And just as the map shows, they were out to, I guess, conquer the Midwest, if they hadn't already. The other story.
Yeah.
That's right. We keep it simple. In fact, train, via. But just the same, it was interesting. They had spent long nights. There's lots of stories that have been written about literally driving all night to get to town hall meetings. And obviously with the advent of technology and just a brazen attitude, in my opinion, they just simply bought a fleet of planes. So having said that, we're going to shift continents for a minute, and you're going to see how this all comes together momentarily. Of course, in the 50s, actually 1949, in East Germany, the Democratic Republic is founded. There's an example of Alexanderplatz. And this gentleman, Gerhard Tiede, is an architect working for, obviously, the DDR. That's the only place you could work in Eastern Germany at the time. And he worked with the Ministry of Health on a variety of projects. This is our assumption here a little bit, listening to stories from our colleagues. But in 1956, he decided to make the move from East Germany to West. At the time, this was still a few years before the wall, of course, in Berlin. So that was 1961. And so when he comes over to the West, it isn't long before he actually starts his own firm. And his first project was for the Evangelical Hospital in Mulheim, and led to a number of hospitals, a significant number of hospitals in West Germany over the course of the next decades. So let's come back from Europe. We'll do the East Coast here in the States. So interesting gentleman, Phil Collins up here, almost fresh out of school, from Princeton, enters for the competition for the New York World's Fair and wins. And the speculation is that the complex tensile structure that was developed and the solution for that structure from his professor at Princeton, who he enlisted on his team. That's where the resolve comes from, we think. He'd never seen anybody for a student competition enlist the faculty to be part of the team, which is fantastic. He wins. So from this, in 1962, realizing that this actually has to get built, and you can think of some metaphors, whether it's Safdie or others here in Canada, similar situation, relatively fresh out of school, significant commissions and winnings to develop and establish. He is joined by Harrison Ewell and Richardson Hoisington to actually form the beginning of what's called CUH, which later becomes CUH2A. And we'll explain what that is here in a few moments. They build the project, and of course that begets a significant number of other projects, fairly prestigious project at the time. So if we fast forward, actually I'm going back, maybe I should say a couple of years. An interesting link that we noticed, Drever Smith, and you'll see Cromarty, Al Cromarty, Ernest Cromarty here for a moment. There was a series of partners that actually had joined in the firm during that time. Not just Al, actually, Armando Sardina and Neil McClellan as well were other partners that were there, but the best we understand and with colleagues in the city, that those were about a year and a half in terms of their tenure or timing. But what was interesting was the work, and a lot attributed to Al Cromarty himself, became extremely modernist in nature. It was some pretty amazing and what we thought, or at least what I think, was quite rigorous work at the time from a design standpoint. And what we found interesting is that the first major architectural project that HDR embarked upon in Omaha, where they were founded and from at the time, was also a federal building, which also was their central post office. So there was this, within a couple of years of each other, the same building type and the same client type, and of course the same style that was kind of embodied in the work. And we've noticed since then a number of parallels in time. So we're going to flip to the West Coast in the States, and Ehrlich Rominger at the time, Joe Ehrlich. Some interesting stories here. He was attributed as the architect who had developed the first clean room, the first computer floor. They used a lot of new approaches in microelectronics, worked for Sun Systems, later worked for Apple, worked for Hewlett-Packard in particular. And it was with Hewlett-Packard that they actually developed an incredible number of innovations that I guess I take for granted today. So we'll come back to them a little later on. Back to our HDR team. By 1972, they had upgraded the planes. They actually had, were moving into the jet territory at the time, interestingly enough. And here they are building their first major headquarters, which is exactly the way you see it in this picture today. We actually call this the gold building. The glazing had a gold sheen or tone to it. This was built in 1972. Moving along, back to Kingston, Harry Smith and Al Cromartie and others, moving through time, LaSalle School and a few other modernist pieces, MacArthur College at Queen's University. A little brutalist in some tone to a degree, but some very interesting work just the same. Very different for the time and place, for sure. And then, of course, this is the era that I kind of indentured in, not quite 1975, I was pretty young then actually, but not too long after that, it was Mill and Ross, as in Michael Ross and Tom Mill joined the firm, and that is the incarnation that I was introduced to. Unfortunately, I never met Harry Smith, but certainly a lot of legacy in the office related to what he brought to the firm. So as we move forward in time, you'll see one more connection back to HDR. Their planes were still regional in nature, but their reach was starting to expand. So in the early 70s, this is about 76, I think, they started working in Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East. And so this project in particular was an extremely large commission that expanded over a significant length of time as well. So that was the first hint, if you will, into the 21st century, or we're already in it, but into the notion of expanding in the 21st century. So all of these different seemingly disparate parts, you're going to see how they start to connect in a moment. So there were a few other acquisitions, some that I know a little less about on the West Coast. Durham, Anderson, and Freed. Durham just happens to be the same name, but of no particular connection. This was in Seattle. They did a lot of ecclesiastical work. An interesting portfolio, but I have not yet figured out exactly how that expanded in the firm since then. Stockwell Stanton in Los Angeles in '76. They did a lot of federal work, and in particular were well known for this particular courthouse, which I would say has influenced a lot of the courthouse and civic work that has been done in the firm since. So here we are compressing time a little bit visually, and you're going to see literally how we've come to discover that it all comes together. So in terms of geography, you've probably already figured this out up on the screen, but the United States in the top few rows, Europe just under there, and Canada here at the bottom. And what's interesting is, of course, all of a sudden in 1976, a gentleman by the name of John Dobney, Kevin Rice, two gentlemen, found a firm in Sydney, Australia. And we'll talk more about that firm in a moment, but some very interesting highlights in their history. So a couple of parallels that we didn't discover until researching for this talk. I had heard a lot about this back in the day, and I know the building quite well. I've worked in it since. The Alcan Research and Development Center in Kingston won the Global Lab of the Year award, which back then, I didn't quite realize how serious this award was, actually, but the likes of Ian Pei, Mies van der Rohe, other architects have won this award previous to this, and I actually didn't realize that until doing this research. But I can now understand why the firm was so proud of this award at the time, and there's an interesting link in a minute to the rest of the company, actually. So here we are in 1983. HDR was bought out, actually, or purchased by a company called Bouygues, a major contractor from Paris, from France, and they were looking to expand from Europe to the Americas, and that acquisition lasted for a while, but not that long. Interestingly enough, you'll see HDR actually reverted to its former self, and I'll explain how in a moment. So this link to Lab of the Year, CUH2A by the 80s and into the 90s, it became one of the major S&T design houses worldwide, actually. And they, in 1986, won Lab of the Year for a Nabisco project in New Jersey, actually. And they had gone on subsequently to win a number of those, whether they be Lab of the Year awards or mentions or various things at the time. So interesting legacy there. So Michael Ross becomes president of the OAA. Some interesting stories in terms of how that led to a later merger that I'll explain in a moment. Back to our friends in Germany. Quite interesting. Following the reunification of Germany, of course, East and West, the office actually takes on the approach to cold call like I've never seen it. They actually wrote over 200 letters, one to every single hospital entity in East Germany, to offer their services, under the intent that Gerhardt had actually understood the system years ago and had lots to offer coming from the West back to the East. And that actually spurred an incredible expansion of the firm in Europe, in Germany proper. So Dusseldorf, Berlin, Leipzig, and Erfurt all were soon to be places where they had offices at the time. So very interesting way to approach growth and expansion within the context. So back to our friends in Australia. Interesting, the first building I set foot in Australia, at least in Sydney, was this building, and I did not realize that it was part of our legacy that it designed it. And I don't have it up here on the screen, but apparently at the time, Pierre Cardin actually figured this was the most beautiful retail experience in the world. That's a pretty extreme quote, certainly from that individual, but well-founded and an incredible space. This commission actually really put Rice Dobney on the map in Australia, and they became quite a leading retail and mixed use and broader architectural firm from that date onward, and set the tone for them to be able to expand and grow. In fact, so much so that they were expanding at quite a rapid rate. However, in 1991, give or take, there was quite a recession, of course, in Australia, not unlike a few other areas, and they decided to take matters in their own hands and expand to Indonesia. They did quite a bit of research, and within a couple of years, they were the largest foreign entity in Indonesia, with about 60 people on the ground in Indonesia and another 30 individuals dedicated to the work back from Sydney. So it was that first era of true international work back and forth from their offices, at least in our history that way. Kind of an interesting personal piece. One of my favorite resorts in the world, for obvious reasons, we went and had our honeymoon here, was the Nico Valley Resort. And I didn't realize until this year that it was actually that group that designed it, and individuals I personally know that actually were involved in the design. So I found that quite fascinating. And of course, the notion of flexibility was that they were able to kind of expand beyond their borders quite readily. Here we are in 1996, all through the 90s. CEI, so those in the audience may recognize where the C and the E and the I come from at West, was established in Vancouver, and we'll get back to that team in a moment. HDR, 1996, it's actually a significant year and something that has marked our firm ever since, and something that's been quite interesting in terms of how we've all come together. The employees, quite an amazing story to this, buy the company back. Actually buy it back for almost exactly the same dollar value it was sold for back in 1983. You can imagine that. And what was quite amazing is that they turned it into what's called an ESOP. So you're probably quite familiar with an employee-owned arrangement. So HDR is fully employee-owned, of which both of us are owners, and many, if not most of the staff broadly are.
Quick stat, yeah, right? That there's no barrier to entry. Anyone, even a recent grad, it doesn't matter. Any employee can buy in, and no employee owns more than 3%.
Right. So an interesting arrangement in terms of how to think about our work and our collective nature, if you will. So a real marked history in the firm, and the growth from that year, was absolutely staggering, and you'll probably see why as this kind of graphic kind of folds onto itself. 1991, a firm is established in Toronto. You probably recognize it, or some may in the room, G&G Architects. A lot of healthcare and pharmaceutical work at the time, and you'll see them appear back shortly. John and Garish will make an appearance here a little later on. So back to our folks on the West Coast, Ehrlich Rominger. This is the first major acquisition with the firm. There were a few others before, of course, but this one was quite significant. the numbers changed drastically in terms of the populace of the firm, and its focus and ability to actually have a number of locations on the west coast of the States really started to play a pivotal role in the work. And of course, acquiring for expertise as well in terms of the nature of the high-tech work that was done at the time. Right about the same time, in Kingston, there was a succession of partners actually that operated Mill and Ross. There's two actually, or three in the picture. Rob Crothers here on the top right, Cam Burns, and that's actually Mike Ross. This gentleman in the middle in this image is John Power. So this was the 150th anniversary of the firm back in 1996. Still before my time, but I do remember the room that picture was taken in. So, 2007. So of course a lot of work has occurred in this time frame, but 2007 is when Mill and Ross is acquired, and we use the word providence for a variety of reasons. I think we can own this one in the sense that I was there when it happened. Interestingly enough, we don't really know whether there was any premonition as to what was going to happen in the economy, especially stateside in 2008. But the acquisition of Mill and Ross in 2007 was very much a mutually beneficial effort. We were in a situation where we were doing a lot of healthcare work, but we saw a change in procurement on the horizon, and we knew that we weren't going to be able to actually get that work done. We just didn't have enough individuals within the firm, and there were continuing partnerships with many folks, or a few folks in the province, but the challenge was how to actually answer to the work that was forthcoming. And so the acquisition allowed us to be able to make that happen for ourselves, and it allowed HDR to make their first international architectural acquisition. We were literally the first ones, and James Chapman is sitting in the third row, and the two of us were very much part of that. We literally flew down to Omaha with another colleague, Ingrid Felso, and got to discover a little bit about that through Michael Ross and the others that made that happen. As we continue, CUH2A from Princeton, New Jersey, acquired, maybe I might just say merged. They were an incredibly large entity on the East Coast. There were, well, at least 300 at the time, if not more. And they had already started to do quite a bit of international work, not unlike our friends in Australia. They actually had an office in London, an office in Dubai, and they had already been quite successful with work in the Middle East. This building actually is now built, the Dubai-Otech, a little different than the rendering there, but that is the rendering from the time. And G&G, 2009, also acquired in Toronto, and of course that, you could probably argue, was a bit of bench strength locally and regionally as we were expanding, and we had partners within the province that had basically said, we need more of a local and regional presence for the work we're doing. And that was one of the ways to answer that request, and there was a lot of work that was produced following that period for sure. Germany, TMK actually is the firm's name by this time, and in 2013, in order to make a very serious bid for a significant project, the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, actually the largest single medical center on a military base anywhere in the world, actually, if I've got my facts right.
Yeah, I think it's just a funny story, right? I think you often hear on the news, airlifted to Germany, you know, Americans who are injured, and it's literally to this hospital.
And so in order to compete for this, it was clear that we needed to have a local presence. So again, this notion of being mutually beneficial. At that time, TMK had offices in Berlin and all the rest of the towns and cities that you see noted. And we actually made the acquisition, and we did win the project, actually. So our offices, whether it be right here in Ottawa, Kingston, many offices have actually partaken in that work, various individuals. Back to our folks in Australia, in 2013, the same year, they are acquired, and they had at the time the single Sydney office. And I would have to say that their work, in my personal opinion, is some of the richest work in the company. I've had the chance to actually visit this facility. It's a shopping center, Wollongong Central. It, to me, is one of the even better, most amazing retail experiences I've ever been in. Absolutely fascinating work in my mind. And they've been continuing on the course of design excellence in the firm ever since. And then finally, in this kind of matrix that you see on the screen, of course, CEI, acquired in 2015. Interesting that now we've actually started to broaden our efforts across the entire country. And of course, CEI has office in Vancouver, Victoria, Penticton, I was just there this last weekend, and Calgary now as well. So, having imagined all of this, I can't say that back in 1846, or whether it be 1917, or any of the foundings of any of the members on the screen, that I think anyone would ever imagine this type of coverage. And what is interesting about this graphic is that, in all honesty, the graphic does represent how we work. We speak of a matrix quite often. I literally, except for Ehrlich Rominger perhaps, but almost every single entity on this screen, or the legacy of all those entities, I'm probably on the phone with every couple of weeks, if not almost daily. We actually work that extensively together. So it's pretty incredible. And for, really honestly, a Kingston boy, imagining a simpler, more local regional presence, I would have myself probably never imagined having the access to this network that we do today. So taking us a little bit more to the present, and where Walter's going to continue, I mentioned paying attention to that little building in the middle of the image back in 1907. Well, that is our current studio, actually in Kingston. So we're on the top floor of the S&R building, and as historical and as complete as the building is on the outside, we certainly chose a much more contemporary aesthetic for our atelier studio off on the top floor. And so here we are, literally present day.
So I think it's funny, we were laughing, we didn't rehearse this front to back beforehand, so I think we are probably going to finish up a little early. Certainly there'll be time for conversation and Q&A, but at the moment, again, we are an integrated AE firm, 9,600 employees, rounded out, in the 6 countries that Jason-Emery flagged, in about 225 offices total, 12 of them being here in Canada, that first international expansion, and active work in 55 countries at the moment. Reach is another word that just appears here, right? That idea of expanding yourself, right? About sort of stretching to cover new territory, new services, in order to remain sustainable and active in practice.
We had mentioned this in the abstract, although I don't think we have a slide that shows it, but obviously this is the commissioned work that we're showing, but we actually have a group, a pro bono group called Design for Others, and so that international reach actually is even broader through that organization. And so that 55 countries is actually commissioned work, but that number goes up when we factor the work that we do pro bono around the world as well.
I think the other thing that's sometimes underappreciated or misunderstood, that 9,600, frankly, that is architecture and engineering. Our architectural team is only a couple of thousand, which, jokes about Kingston Collegiate aside, it's like a large high school. I mean, we really are very intimate with all of our partners. Sometimes that's helped out through technology, but we also do travel a fair amount to just make those personal connections and understand who's at the other end of the line and just helping you out on the particular effort that you're on. I did want to come back to, I guess every year since the firm bought itself back from Reed, there has been a cycle of 5-year strategic plans, an attempt to better understand who we are and who we want to be. And again, I think we've been trying to find these themes, right, of what has kind of propelled the firm through generations. And I think there is, at HDR, a very fundamental understanding of what we're good at and an ability to, again, stretch that and expand that border, but not in kind of unforeseen leaps or sort of complete blind stabs. It really is considered. So the last time it came together was 2012. Here we are in 2017. Again, just another coincidence. 2017 is quite a year for many, many reasons, but we're winding down a 2017 strategic plan, kicking off a plan which is going to take us to 2022. That plan at that time, and I think we can maybe click through, focused on 4 themes. So unleashing the power of our people. I know Jason-Emery's got the running list, but if you think back on all of those kind of key words that we were using throughout the presentation, apprenticeship comes to mind, legacy, again, this idea of furthering the abilities of the staff that you've got, right, of really pushing them to the max, of understanding their future, and frankly, again, planning for that succession, understanding how the firm will evolve through its people. Meaningful experiences, to be known for premier project delivery and high-value results. I think all of the examples you can see, we've certainly never been shy of large, complicated projects, and maybe to loop it back to the people, I think it grows a skill set within your staff, that is able to tackle those difficult endeavors, and I think it's what prepared us, frankly, for a lot of the P3 activity that's happening here in the province.
Yeah, and I mean, something that I've realized maybe personally is that the concept of, or the notion of developing or designing meaningful experiences, there may be one way or approach within the context that I'm aware of, but I've personally found incredible richness, and you can probably hear the interest in our Australian practice and learning from them about how to go about design in other contexts and other ways. And so I would say that second bullet has been very much a result of being able to kind of cross-pollinate through that network in ways that we wouldn't have expected or imagined previously.
Elevate total service capabilities. There, again, it's sort of the idea of stretching what you do, whether that's market sector, but perhaps, again, it's literally skill sets and capabilities. So evolving into tackling a sort of more of a full circle of project life, cost estimating, programming, equipment. So within the firm, there exist experts who do focus on these sort of specific aspects where, truthfully, locally, we often do partner. It's not always internal. But what is comforting is that if you want an opinion, frankly, an inside opinion on what something means, there is that voice. That voice exists within the firm. So whether it's applied directly or whether it's just a resource, it is very powerful to have that tool in the kit.
And an example of that is we were very independent in putting the work together for the talk today, but we reached a milestone or a point where we just couldn't find certain images or certain things, and the APV went out at about 10 o'clock one morning on this was a few days ago, and within 2 or 3 hours, a network of 3 or 4 people found every single thing we were looking for. I mean, and these were just favors, frankly, but it was pretty incredible to have that power and that access to that information at hand.
And lastly, to perform as a global company. So again, I suppose what's important to realize is that these were set 5 years ago. So perhaps if we were, as I say, that memento kind of way to rewind the clock, what Jason-Emery and I are now assessing is, how good did we make on this promise? I think you see, Australia, Germany, the continued expansion in Canada. I mean, really that does tackle that final point. But in general, I think the 4 themes apply at any time, right? This idea of investing in your people, investing in your skills, investing in growing your capabilities and services, investing in geographic expansion.
And one interesting anecdote, Scott Butler, our Director of International Operations, when we were talking about this, was kind of doing a little sleuthing for the talk. He said, one of the things that we learned, he was the president of COH2A a number of years ago, he said, what we fundamentally learned was that we broadened our reach geographically to actually become experts in fields we didn't even expect to be experts in. And so by being the expatriate almost in a foreign land, often it offered opportunities that weren't available at home because there were pre-established players in those markets. And so they often went to other markets thinking that they were expanding geographically, but realizing that they were expanding their expertise all at the same time to bring that back.
Yeah, I think I would use the CEI team as an example. They focused on healthcare as well. They're about 50% healthcare, I think. But in particular, their second strongest sector was sport and recreation. And so now they are feeding back in the loop. I say this a lot, right? They are contributing to the firm as a whole. And an interest in sport and rec, while it sort of maybe existed in some embryonic state in a few of the offices, is now a going focus, and really through Mark Hensey's leadership out of the Vancouver office. And it's another Scott Butler story, but he uses this metaphor, I suppose, this idea of as you join a large organization, I guess in this example, I mean, you can be an ice cube that's dropped into a bucket and melts, or you can be the ice cube that freezes the rest of the bucket. Now, being a physics guy, that makes no sense whatsoever, but as a metaphor, it's an interesting one. So, as we were saying, this kind of high school that we're in, right, it's important to share. It's important to contribute, right? We're not just passive receivers of what's going on around us. We're active contributors to the development of the firm as a whole. And you see that at an individual level, you see it at an office level, at a country level. It's really, really fascinating.
So these bullets, again, they're really just prompts. I think we all know intuitively probably what some of them mean, but they are just the issues that we're contemplating as we prepare, and in fact we can probably pop to the next slide for this 2022 strategic plan. So right this moment, in fact, Tuesday I participated in a meeting where we are organizing our thoughts around where we want to be as a firm come 2022. But in particular, we're being asked, each country in fact is being asked to prepare its own strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan. Where do we want to be? Who do we want to be in 2022? And so these are, again, not imposed. This is us. This is me, Jason-Emery, James, working together to create this vision with all of our colleagues in Canada. So I'm going to shout them out. Again, this is sort of me declaring, come find me in 2022. This is where we'll be. But integrating CEI into our Ontario fold, we're going to be one pan-Canadian operation. As Jason-Emery said, we're 100% employee-owned, self-sufficient, present here in our local communities. Our 4 Ontario offices are active practices in those communities. Sorry, they're not post office boxes. They're mid-sized practices. You know, we're doing local work.
Speaking of that, this is our studio in Westboro. So when we're not dredging up the archives, we're creating ceiling sculptures to represent the region and its morphing history. So it's tales for another day.
This is interesting too. I was telling Jason-Emery this morning that I was challenged, right, to really push Canadian values back into the rest of the firm. So this is actually a list from Romano of all people, ex-premier, but fairness, diversity, equity, inclusion, health, safety, economic security, democracy, and sustainability. I mean, it's amazing actually how many of those have architectural overtones. But again, the idea of really the firm globally evolving through the contributions of the individual countries and participants. So we will continue to focus on our core capabilities. You saw it all the way back to that first commission. And again, one of the things that I find really interesting about HDR is I feel like we know ourselves. Again, we don't kind of go down blind alleys. So health, education, science and tech, sport and rec is a new ad, public safety. That idea, again, to me, what pulls them all together is an interest in holistic wellness and all of our successes, I guess, at all levels. We do want to grow. Again, increase geographic reach and continual progression both in revenue and staff through organic growth and potential mergers. We've just opened a Calgary office. It's got about 6 individuals in it. We're trying to make it go there. But again, I mean, in the name of legacy and succeeding, enduring through generations, I think it is important to target growth. Status quo is okay. I think focusing on growth is a little more forgiving, actually. Your valleys look a little like plateaus and less like a decline. So we are interested in growth. Maybe you could speak to this, actually. Here's yours, baby.
Well, no doubt. I mean, I fundamentally aspire and subscribe to the fact that design adds meaning to the world. I hope everyone in this room would think that for sure. But as we expand the network, and it is wonderful to have all of that access and cross-pollination, there is a rigor, a continued rigor, actually an increased rigor that we are demanding of our design work, and we want it to increase in its quality. And as we, as I say, expand reach, we really want to be careful and focused on the work moving forward as well. It is wonderful to speak to all of those business over and undertones. They're extremely important. They are the survival of, obviously, this legacy we speak of, but the legacy also needs to speak for itself. And there are different ways and kind of perspectives one could consider that legacy. Certainly in my capacity, it tends to bend a little bit more to the design aspect of our practice, and hopefully we're going to be able to continue to evolve and expand and grow that. Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you.